Ukrainian strike on a Russian submarine deep inside a Black Sea port shatters the Kremlin's narrative that Russia is winning. Winning armies do not lose $400 million weapons in their own ports. They do not retreat their fleets, and they do not absorb constant losses while claiming momentum.
David Deptula is a retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General. Welcome to our program, General Deptula.
Hey, it's great to be back, Daniel. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, likewise. Ukrainian underwater drones hit Russian Kilo-class submarine on Monday in Novorossiysk, a large Russian naval base. This is the first time since the Second World War that Russia has lost a submarine in combat. What is your reaction to this Ukrainian special operation?
First of all, the Ukrainian forces that did this and the leadership behind it should be congratulated for their continued innovative application of force to defend their nation. I think this is important because as negotiations intensify, Ukrainian strike on a Russian submarine deep inside a Black Sea port shatters the Kremlin's narrative that Russia is winning. Winning armies do not lose $400 million weapons in their own ports. They do not retreat their fleets, and they do not absorb constant losses while claiming momentum. So what's happening is Russia's manpower is being drained. Its military capital is being burned faster than it can be replaced, and its economy is being hollowed out under sanctions. It'd be nice if we increase those sanctions, but that's another discussion. But this is the reality, and negotiations must be based on reality, not propaganda, because wars end when the aggressor can no longer sustain the cost, and Ukraine is continuing actions to raise the cost for the Russians. So this is an excellent move, and I think it will wake those up who are involved in the negotiations that Ukraine is not losing, they're in fact winning in this conflict.
What does this also reveal about drone warfare and their role in the 21st century war?
Well, Daniel, it shows that drones are tools. They have not changed the nature of warfare, but they certainly have provided capabilities that, in this case, Ukraine has been used very effectively to counter some of the mass that the Russians bring to the equation. So I think they're being more effectively used, and Ukraine's leading in the way and showing the world how to capitalize on uninhabited vehicles, whether they be in the air, on land, or at sea.
Let's cover also current situation on the ground. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made a surprise visit to the frontline city of Kupiansk, which Russia has claimed to capture. Ukrainian forces are now making progress and pushing Russians out of the city. What is your assessment of this decision by the President of Ukraine to visit front lines? And is this another reminder that Ukraine still has some cards, some leverage on the battlefield?
Well, I think President Zelensky's visit to Kupiansk is powerful precisely because it exposes the gap between Russian propaganda and reality. Moscow routinely announces supposed victories that exist only on paper, while Ukrainian forces continue to defend, counterattack, and reclaim territory through real sacrifice. But beyond the battlefield, Kupiansk symbolizes why Ukrainians are fighting at all. This is not an ideological struggle or a geopolitical game. It's a fight for Ukraine's survival and for the right of Ukraine to exist as a sovereign nation. And history shows that whenever Russia advances, even temporarily, it brings repression, torture, forced passportization, deportation of children, and the systemic destruction of Ukrainian identity. Now, Ukrainians understand from centuries of experience that if Russia is not stopped and defeated, it will not compromise. It returns again and again to try to erase Ukrainian statehood. Kupiansk is not just a town, it's a line between freedom and forced Russification.
Let's also cover this breaking news about negotiations. Finnish President Alexander Stubb just said, quote, "We are probably closer to peace agreement than we have been at any time during these 4 years." How close are we to a deal on ending this war in Ukraine?
Well, I think that every serious peace effort is welcome. But Ukrainians know that peace without security is an illusion. History has taught us that agreements with Russia that lack enforcement do not end wars. They merely pause them until Moscow is ready to strike again. Look, Ukraine has tried compromise repeatedly. I'd like to remind your audience that since 2014, Ukraine participated in over 200 negotiations, agreed to 20 ceasefires, and Russia violated every single one. Russia also violated the Budapest Memorandum, the 1997 Friendship Treaty, and both Minsk agreements. So this pattern goes back centuries. A deal can only be meaningful if it precludes future Russian aggression. Otherwise, any agreement will simply delay the next invasion. And Ukrainians, they will not reject peace, but they should rightfully reject surrender disguised as diplomacy.
Let's also try to analyze the main offers from this deal, main points, and the most difficult one is about territory. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin demands Ukrainian surrender, withdrawal from Donbas region. President Zelensky said that US proposed a compromise right now under which Ukrainian forces would withdraw from the Donbas while Russian troops would stay in place. And President Zelensky calls this unfair offer because Russians will stay in place and could also move forward inside this so-called demilitarized zone, because under this offer, this demilitarized zone would not be policed or secured by any international force. What are the risks and could this plan work and deter Russia from moving forward inside this zone, which should be demilitarized?
Well, it's what you laid out is the heart of the problem, and it's very complex. So bear with me a bit on my answer. I think that President Zelensky's position is deeply pragmatic. NATO membership is not a symbolic issue for Ukraine, it's about security. So if Ukraine is offered security guarantees that are genuinely equivalent to NATO's Article 5, being automatic, binding, and enforceable, then that's a viable alternative for Ukraine to consider. What Ukraine cannot accept is a plan that weakens its defenses or forces troop withdrawals while Russia remains armed, aggressive, and unpunished. That would be fundamentally unfair and dangerous. Ukrainians know that Russian occupation does not bring peace. It brings repression. Wherever Russia controls territory, Ukrainian language, culture, religion, and identity are erased. Churches are seized, children are deported, people are tortured, and dissent is crushed. So security guarantees must ensure that this can never happen again, not just promise it on a piece of paper. Now, with respect to the proposed Donbas demilitarized zone or a free economic zone, what that would do is not be a zone of peace. It would be a zone of Russian manipulation, false flag operations, and permanent instability. I think you and your audience are well aware that Russia has a long record of using demilitarized zones and special zones, as they call them, as staging grounds for future aggression. So these kinds of arrangements would weaken Ukraine's security, restrict its sovereignty, and give Moscow time and space to regroup. Ukrainians understand that compromise without enforcement does not stop Russian aggression. It will only postpone it. Every time Russia's been rewarded with territory or ambiguity, it's returned with greater violence. Examples are Abkhazia and South Ossetia, Crimea, Nagorno-Karabakh in Syria, among others. So, Ukraine and Europe needs to be very, very careful in our right to warn about the false premises of a DMZ or a free economic zone.
Also, according to Bloomberg, European allies are concerned that this could be seen as a Russian Trojan horse, because this could be used by Russian side just to move forward in several years, just to strike Ukraine again with much bigger and devastating force.
Yeah, I think Russia's interest in controlling a demilitarized zone tells us much regarding their intentions. Moscow doesn't seek neutrality, it seeks leverage. A Russian-controlled or influenced demilitarized zone would function as a pressure point inside Ukraine, enabling intelligence operations, destabilization, and renewed military action at a time of Russia's choosing. So Ukraine and Europe are right to firmly oppose this idea. Ukrainians have learned over 400 years of experience that Russia uses temporary arrangements as tools of permanent domination. So trusting Moscow to fairly administer or influence a security zone would be a strategic mistake, as history demonstrates they simply cannot be trusted.
From your perspective, could this demilitarized zone work without physical deployment of US or European troops inside this zone?
No, I don't think so. I think for the reasons that I already stated, it is nothing more than a ruse by the Russians to pre-position themselves for future military action, and so it's not a good idea.
Also, let's cover this Article 5-like security guarantees. There are lots of discussions about this topic because Trump's administration, according to Axios, is offering Ukraine, quote, strong, legally binding security guarantee on modeled Article 5. This could also move forward inside the Congress, could be approved by US Congress, and this would be another separate deal agreement between US and Ukraine on security commitments. But would this be enough to deter Russia, and can Ukrainians really trust this mechanism, legally binding mechanism?
Well, I think the last comment that you made is very important. It needs to be legally binding. And I recently wrote an article that was published in Forbes about how security guarantees from the air, in conjunction with those on the ground, are really the foundation of a lasting peace in Ukraine. The Washington Post reported recently, just as you talked about, that U.S. officials see security guarantees as crucial. While at the same time, Russia's been rejecting European troops in Ukraine. And so it's important to recognize, again, that Russia only respects strength. So if Moscow rejects European troops on the ground, there are three pillars that can form the foundation of security guarantees from the air. First is a robust air defense umbrella. Second is a modern and sufficient Ukrainian Air Force. And third is visible and engaged allied air power backing. And together, I think these can create a layered system of deterrence, protection, and stability. So if Ukraine's skies are defended by robust integrated air defenses, if its fighter force is expanded to credible numbers, and if allied aircraft stand ready to reinforce deterrence by guaranteeing Ukraine's security, then I think Russia will think twice before violating a settlement. I also think it's important to remember that Konrad Adenauer once said, never, never trust Russia. And I think that's important because Ukraine's position is not emotional in requiring viable security guarantees. It's historical, it's strategic, and it's based on repeated experience with Russia.
What kind of role can US air power play in securing peace in Ukraine if Trump's administration decides to also commit any kind of air power to this multinational mission in Ukraine?
Well, what I alluded to is that the allies who would be supporting this guarantee need to include the United States. And that means U.S. aircraft are part of the Allied air power backing effort, which would mean that they would be flying not just intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance gathering air patrols, but also flying combat aircraft to reinforce and, if necessary, come to Ukraine's aid in defending against any violation of an agreement by the Russians.
From your perspective, can European allies conduct such full-scale mission inside Ukraine without US, so-called US backstop in air?
Yeah, no, they could. I mean, but again, the power of the agreement would be reinforced by commitment from the United States to also participate. I mean, why not? This is the whole point. You want to build a security agreement and guarantee that the Russians are going to respect. And they're going to respect it if they know that U.S. aircraft are also going to be part of that security guarantee.
Do you feel that this is also important to include options for military retaliation inside this possible agreement in case if Russia violates ceasefire, just to let Russia know beforehand what Russian troops could face in case of such military violation of the deal?
No, absolutely. That absolutely has to be part of the agreement and the understanding, because that's what deterrence is all about. Making it very clear to the Russians just what the red lines are and that there will be a response.
This is really important topic, and let's also cover Ukrainian Air Force. Ukraine plans to build a new big Air Force with up to 100 French Rafale jets and 100 Swedish Gripen fighter jets. How practical would it be for Ukraine to operate different types of fighter aircraft simultaneously?
Well, it's certainly a challenge, but here are the facts. Ukraine's plan to modernize its Air Force is an absolute requirement for its future survival, because that's how it gains deterrence. A strong, modern, westernized Ukrainian Air Force is essential to ensure that Russia never again believes it can attack Ukraine with impunity. Ukrainians are not fighting to become a militarized state. They're fighting so their children can live in a safe, democratic country, not a Russian colony or puppet state. Now, I go back to history. History shows that Ukraine has deep democratic traditions. From the Veche assemblies of Kievan Rus to the Cossack Rada to Magdeburg law cities, Ukrainians value self-rule, accountability, and freedom. And a capable Air Force of sufficient size will help guarantee that those values can survive in the face of an aggressive Russia. Ukraine's incorporation and use of the F-16s, the small number of F-16s that they've been given, is incredible, with some of the pilots accumulating, on the order of 100 kills against Russian drones that attack Ukrainian cities. So Ukrainian Air Force personnel are very adept at incorporating new tactics, techniques, and procedures and flying different aircraft. So I'm sure they will be able to assimilate the Rafale and Gripen into their fighter force over the years that will be required to modernize its Air Force.
What are the main differences between Rafale, Gripen, and F-16 fighter jets? It could be really interesting for our audience to have better understanding about this air assets.
Well, each of the aircraft have different capabilities, but they are all what are known as fourth generation fighters. They do not have inherent stealth, which is one of the advantages that are retained in the F-35. I personally would like to see Ukraine get F-35s, but they have an offer on the table from both France and Sweden for Rafale and Gripen fighters. I'd like to see them get more F-16s. But the Gripen is, in a nutshell, actually all of these aircraft are what are known as multi-role aircraft. They can perform both air superiority or air-to-air missions as well as surface attack missions. The Gripen has been specifically designed to be able to operate from unimproved airstrips and places like highways and makeshift runways. The Rafale is a very agile combat aircraft, and each one of them, quite frankly, has unique characteristics that Ukraine could put to good use in their Air Force. I think the rationale of having multiple aircraft, while it would be nice to have a consolidated fleet surrounding a core number of aircraft, two or three different types are certainly not something that would pose an inordinate problem for the Ukrainian Air Force to observe, as even with the former Soviet Union aircraft that they currently possess, they operate many different types.
You also just mentioned about F-35 fighter jets. Would it be a credible objective for Ukraine to seek to acquire such jets in the future? I mean, due to the high costs and also this matter of logistics, sustainability, and maintenance of such costly aircraft?
Well, that's certainly a consideration. But, one of the points that people sometimes tend to forget or overlook is they tend to focus on individual unit cost of a particular aircraft without taking into consideration the capabilities or the effects that a single or a handful of those aircraft can accomplish. Low observability and stealth provides a degree of leverage that really amplifies the impact of a low observable aircraft. So one can do with a handful of F-35s that it would take a squadron of non-stealthy aircraft to accomplish. But again, these are details that a nation like Ukraine needs to take into consideration. And with an offer on the table from France and Sweden, it is probably prudent to move forward with plans to incorporate those fourth generation aircraft first, but certainly keep the door open to acquiring F-35s in the future.
Like also to cover our final topics, and I would like to ask you some questions about Ukrainian long-range capabilities. Ukraine made Flamingo cruise missile and other ballistic missiles, which we expect to be produced in bigger amounts in the upcoming months. Could this be enough to deter Russia from future aggression? What is your personal assessment of Flamingo missile, and don't you think that this could be helpful for Ukraine as such enough as could helpful, for example, Tomahawk cruise missile? How can you compare these capabilities?
Yeah, well, I go back to the fact, well, first, Ukraine building the Flamingo, they should be applauded for doing that. And the reason that they're building these long-range capabilities is with their current Air Force, they currently lack the ability to penetrate Russian defenses at distance to be able to achieve desired effects. And as a result, they're building the Flamingo and other long-range systems in order to be able to do that. So they're part of the equation that provides Ukraine the ability to achieve strategic effects by striking critical targets deep in the heart of Russia. And they should increase their ability to do so. For the past 3.5 years, I've been urging the United States to remove any restrictions on weapons that it provides Ukraine in order to do that, because an adversary like Russia should not be provided a sanctuary. That violates all the tenets of modern warfare. Ukraine needs to keep producing these. They will not necessarily win the war alone, but they will certainly increase the pressure on Russia and get them to realize that this war is not just going to be fought on Ukrainian territory, but it brings the war home to Russia and ultimately will get the Russian people to recognize that they need to stop their aggression in order to halt these attacks. So they're a very critical part of Ukrainians' strategic policy. Now, let me close with this. Daniel, you've been very kind with your time. I want to remind your audience, and they know this, but maybe others out there don't, that Ukrainians are not fighting out of hatred. They're fighting out of responsibility. Responsibility to their children, to Europe, and to the idea that borders and nations cannot be erased by force. If Russia is not defeated, it will not stop. If Ukraine stands and wins, it proves that freedom is still defendable. So keep up the great work, Ukraine. There are many of us out here that will do everything we can to continue your support.
Thank you, General Deptula, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Heroam Slava.